Hi folks, it's Mikel Weisser, chief writer for Cannabiz News, and I'm thrilled to welcome you to the first episode of the Keith Stroup Show. This is a weekly update on the politics of marijuana with the star of our show, the man who launched the entire marijuana movement, founder of NORML, Mr. Keith Stroup. Hey Keith, how's it going?
Well, I think it's an exciting time. There are all kinds of things happening on the issue, but I will tell you there's also some developments that give me pause for serious concern. I mean, I am not happy to see this latest group of state-compliant marijuana businesses find that they've lost their banking privileges, etc. They're throwing hundreds of new retailers and wholesalers that are legally licensed back on the black market, and that is not a good sign for anyone. And from what I've seen, I think it's probably a reflection of people's concern about Jeff Sessions as our new Attorney General, and I share that concern, and I'll be happy to dig deeper into that if you'd like as the program gets on.
Yes, when we get further into the program, I'd like to discuss that. But before we start with the heavy news, let me ask you, Keith Stroup, what are you smoking this week?
Actually, I'm smoking a blend that a grower in Northern California has come up with, where he put together OG Kush, and I forget. I should have checked that out before I came on. I forget the second strain that he put together. He calls it OG Humboldt, and it's a wonderful strain. Now, for about 2 or 3 years before that, from the same grower, I was smoking Trainwreck, and I like it a lot. It's, of course, a strong sativa. This is too. I think, I am incredibly proud that we grow the highest quality marijuana in the world today right here, homegrown. And I'm old enough to remember when you mentioned homegrown marijuana used to mean ditchweed. Nobody wanted it. You couldn't give it away. Today, it's the best in the world.
OG Humboldt, huh? Well, I'm smoking Bordello, which is a blueberry-type strain. It's really yummy. We'll check in on this again next week. So in the meantime, it's been a really busy week. We've got new federal cannabis bills from Beto O'Rourke and Matt Gaetz. There's some ominous rumblings from prohibitionist in chief Jeff Sessions, the last of the true reefer maniacs. Kansas City joins Houston and Dallas in the decriminalization movement, and the local NORML chapter led the way. And Rhode Island is considering giving it a 7th attempt at legalization. There's Uruguay, there's Ohio. What do you want to talk about, Keith?
Well, I think it's helpful for people to realize that when they hear about bills introduced in Congress, those are always important. So in some ways, I would put that at the top of the heap. We have something like 10 different bills currently pending in Congress that are all pro-marijuana. We've never had anywhere near that number. We have a larger number of co-sponsors. We have new people willing to stand up. But what I really want listeners to understand is these bills that are being introduced are largely symbolic. They do indicate progress we're making. We have more federally elected officials willing to stand up and introduce a bill that does what everybody sort of knows we need to do. 70% of the country says it should be up to the states, and 60% say it should be fully legalized. But nonetheless, not a single one of these bills is likely to have a hearing this year in Congress or to have a vote in Congress. So these are important, but they're symbolic.
For people who want to know more about the bills that are filed in Congress, Marijuana Business Daily's new article, Marijuana on the Hill, filed on April 4th, breaks down the bills that have been filed in a short, clear list. Speaking of that list, one of the big packages of bills filed this year came from members of the brand new Congressional Cannabis Caucus. It's called the Pathway to Marijuana Reform. What do you think about that, Keith?
Yeah, and that really was a kind of a combination. It was a press conference they held to announce this, but it was a combination of 3 other bills that have been introduced separately, SB 776, HB 1841, and HB 1823. And basically what they would do, it's a wonderful package of bills. It would remove marijuana altogether from the Controlled Substances Act. You know, all of this debate about whether it should be in Schedule 1 or Schedule 2 or Schedule 3. The truth is it shouldn't be on the Controlled Substances Act at all. Alcohol's not on it, tobacco's not on it, and marijuana should not be on it. So this bill would remove marijuana from the Controlled Substances Act. It would, in fact, take marijuana enforcement totally away from the DEA, and it would, I think it would give it to the Bureau of Alcohol Control or one of those. And then it would implement a federal excise tax on marijuana as well, which, of course, is an incentive to pick up some support among members of Congress that might not be pro-marijuana but might like the new revenue that would bring. Now, again, I want to make the point. None of these bills are likely to get a hearing this year, let alone a vote. So this is largely symbolic, but it's still important because it gets reported in the press. Every member of Congress reads about this and realizes this is becoming far more realistic. Now, where we may make progress this year is when they do their continuing resolutions on the budget bill. That's where we've made our progress in the past. We passed 2 years ago what was then the Rohrabacher-Farr amendment to the appropriations bill, and it made it impossible for the DEA to spend any federal funds to enforce laws against individuals or companies that were compliant under state law. So in any of the states where, for medical marijuana, I should say, it was limited to medical marijuana. But it was terribly important because, it really does mean a lot. And there are actually some lawyers out in California right now that have brought a suit claiming that even some what would appear to be unrelated federal prosecutions of people in California may, in fact, be a violation of this amendment that was passed last year. And that was passed 242 to 189. Now, this year, there is going to be a second attempt at an amendment to the budget bill. It'll be called the McClinton-Polis bill. And when a similar bill was introduced last year in 2015, it only failed 222 to 206, so a swing of 9 votes.
Wow. And
we would have won that. So I honestly expect that we have a realistic chance to win that. What it means is it would take the same prohibition that the Rohrabacher-Blumenthal bill does on medical marijuana, but it also applies it to the states that have recreational marijuana. It simply says the federal government has to stay out of those states and let the states go ahead and implement those laws.
That is, stay out of state-run programs, basically.
That's correct.
That doesn't mean that cartel action in otherwise legal states now becomes free from federal prosecution, right?
Oh, no. At least for the moment, the belief is legally, most of these have not been tested yet, but the belief is that the feds could always go in, for example, and bust a dispensary in Colorado, even though they may have a license and they're legally selling out the front door. If the feds find that they're selling out the back door illegally and it's going out of state, you bet they can bust them. And they have. They did several just in the past 2 weeks. So what these are saying is that as long as an individual or a business is honestly operating under the provisions provided by the state law, whether it's medical marijuana or full legalization, the feds could not spend any money to go after those folks. They must leave them alone. It's not the direct repeal of federal prohibition that we eventually need, but for the moment, it's as close as we can get.
One of the key bills in that pathway to marijuana reform package is called the Small Business Equity Act. It aims at exempting state-compliant cannabis operations from the 280E section of tax law. You were talking about that earlier with the current problem of marijuana businesses in mass, even ancillary businesses involved in the marijuana industry. They're having their bank accounts closed with no warning. Can you explain how the banks can get away with that?
Yeah, I think most people that are not involved in the industry probably presume, and I think most rational people would also agree. By the way, I apologize if you hear a dog barking in the background. That's what happens when you work from your home office.
What kind of dog?
But there are in a rescue mutt.
Thank you.
And clearly not very well trained, as you can tell. So what really happens is there are all kinds of prohibitions that make it difficult for these businesses, even these businesses that are in good faith trying to operate properly under state regulations. It makes it difficult because most banks will not do business with them. Most credit card processing companies will not do business with them. So we end up in the situation where we are encouraging the majority of the players in this multi-billion-dollar business to be operating on a cash basis. And that's absolutely idiotic. I don't think there's any there's no prosecutor. There's no one who's rationally looked at this would think that there's some advantage to having this as a cash-only operation. Well, there have been a few companies that have surfaced that have been willing to provide banking services and credit card services to these legitimate industry companies in Colorado and Oregon and the other states where it's been legalized, Washington and Alaska. But just today, there were a whole slew of them that suddenly lost those banking and credit card privileges. And let me tell you why this hits home. NORML is actually a consumer-focused organization. We're primarily interested in representing the interests of the responsible marijuana smoker. We're not a business lobby. But those threats that were felt so strongly by a large number of people in the industry today also impact us. About a year ago, all of a sudden, after having the same credit card processing service for many years, we were given less than 30 days notice. I think we were given 15 days notice. And all of a sudden, we could not accept credit cards. No one would process them. And I thought initially I could just go to another processor. But in fact, we went for over a month before we were able to identify someone who would indeed take our legitimate processing. And as you know, with most nonprofits, and NORML is the same, we are totally dependent on our website, which means you must be able to accept credit cards. So we had no income for about 5 weeks last year until we solved this problem. And I feel terrible for those businesses that were similarly impacted today. I'm sure for the next few days or few weeks, they're going to be scurrying around trying to figure out how do I run a successful business without a credit card processing service.
Back in January, we reported that 6,500 cannabis-related bank accounts were closed by major banks in 2016. And then there was also thousands of accounts in those same biggest banks that were operating clandestinely. Now, for those of you who want to know more about this topic, the article that Keith's talking about is called Marijuana-Related Accounts Dumped en Masse by Banks and Payment Processing Providers. It's on Inc.com. Now, this whole 280E stuff, didn't Senator Elizabeth Warren start the session that way, talking about this problem?
Oh, there's no doubt. There's a couple of bills pending in Congress right now that are aimed precisely at allowing businesses that are marijuana-related businesses to take those deductions that they're not now permitted to take under 280E. That's a little separately from the bank processing and the banking issue, but it's all related. It's if you're going to say that it's now legal, if you have the proper license, to commercially cultivate and sell marijuana, then of course you need the regular banking privileges and you need to be able to deduct your business expenses, most of which marijuana businesses cannot do under the current tax act.
They can't even deduct their employees' salaries, right?
I think that's correct. There's a certain category, it's kind of limited, that they're still allowed to deduct, but it's very limited. And it ends up being mostly what I read is that their effective tax rate is somewhere like 75 to 78%. I mean,
God.
Very few businesses in America could survive with that kind of a tax rate. So, I mean, there has to be some relief. And to be honest, it's partly what I think of our current Congress, but I suspect long before we get any relief to the individual who's still being arrested under federal law and prosecuted for marijuana offenses, we will get some relief for the marijuana businesses, because if there's one thing this Republican Congress is, it's a business-friendly Congress.
Well, they say the business of America is business. I believe that we're seeing a steadily rising groundswell of support from the American people, even if it isn't being supported by our, quote, leaders. But there are efforts going on all around the country at state and even local levels. NORML chapters and other citizens are pushing for reform at their level. Last week, there was a huge victory for a chapter in Missouri, right?
That's right. It's the Kansas City, Missouri NORML chapter, and it was totally a project of the local NORML group. They're to be applauded indeed, and I know that our outreach coordinator, Kevin Mamalji, is in the process of making sure that other local NORML groups around the country realize that even if their state legislature is bulky, as they are in Missouri, and even if they've tried a couple of times to qualify a voter initiative in Missouri, they got very close last year but failed because of the shortness of signatures in one particular county. But they're going to come back. But even before they come back statewide, there's progress that can be made on the municipal level. So I think that's what those fine folks in Kansas City demonstrated can be replicated in cities all across the country.
Shout out to this week's sponsor, ultratrust.net, for their support. Rocco Beatrice Sr., the founder of UltraTrust, is one of the nation's foremost experts on asset protection. His articles can be seen in USA Today, ABC News, CBS News, Fox News, and many more. Rocco can help you protect your assets from seizure, creditors, legal actions of all kinds, and hide them from prying eyes. Visit Rocco online at ultratrust.net, where you can download his free report, Managing the Risk of Loss, and learn numerous ways to protect your assets. That's ultratrust.net, ultratrust.net. Here's a little bit of additional background. On Tuesday, April 4th, the citizens of Kansas City, Missouri had a special election and overwhelmingly voted for decriminalizing minor cannabis possession. People in Kansas City can now possess up to 30 grams at a time with a fine that's no more than $25. More than 74% of the voters said yes. Now that's a definitive statement of approval. Then there's all the state-level reform going on. Even though we don't have a great record of marijuana law changing in our favor at the federal level, they are changing everywhere all the time at the state level. It looks like Rhode Island's going to try to pass legalization again. What's this going to be, the 7th time?
And I think New Hampshire is still trying around the edges. We thought when the season was starting that there would be a serious effort made in Vermont, New Hampshire, and Rhode Island. And there has been. But it looks right now like Rhode Island may be the one most likely to actually occur this year. One reason that is important, people may not understand. While we have been incredibly successful with voter initiatives and for full legalization, all 8 of the states that have legalized marijuana have done it by voter initiative. The reason Rhode Island would be important would be because it would be the first time we have done it through the state legislature. And remember that of the 50 states, only 24, I believe, currently have a voter initiative as an option. And for those who don't know, there is no federal version of a voter initiative. We get people calling the office suggesting that we have a federal initiative. Well, there is no such thing, I'm sorry to say. But 24 of the states have them, and where they have them, of course, we'll continue to try to use them to our advantage and go around the state legislature. But it's terribly important in the balance of the states that we begin to develop the ability to pass full legalization proposals through those state elected officials, because otherwise we've got half the country that's still out on a limb.
One thing we don't have protection from anywhere in the country is what happens if Jeff Sessions decides to do the pending federal crackdown. If Jeff Sessions has his way, things could look pretty ugly. Last week, there were some ominous rumblings coming out of the DOJ. Sessions put out a memo Wednesday to his attorneys around the country that was supposedly addressing violent crime, but also included quite a bit of language about marijuana in it. Tell me, Keith, how is violent crime connected to marijuana, especially the marijuana industry?
Well, I think only in the mind of people like Jeff Sessions. You know, Jeff truly is one of the old reefer maniacs, as you well know, Michael. He said a few years ago of the Ku Klux Klan that he always liked them until he found out that they enjoyed smoking pot. How's that for an interesting statement? He later claimed that was a joke, but I'm not sure it was. But more recently, as you know, and it wasn't a joke at all, he actually said at a committee hearing in the Senate that good people do not smoke marijuana. So we're dealing with a man who is 50 years out of date. I don't think there's a chance in hell that he's going to change his impression. I mean, he's comfortable as an anti-drug zealot, and he's going to remain that direction. The question is whether the president is going to give him the leeway to totally screw up the current state-compliant legal marijuana industry. Frankly, someone called me not too long ago, as I'm sure they do all of us who are active in the movement, to ask for some advice on investing in this new green rush created by the legalization of marijuana. And I said, man, if I were you and you've got the resources to do that, then I would sit on them until I find out what the Trump administration is going to do. It would be idiotic to race out right now and make an investment because that industry could be shut down if Jeff Sessions is given the leeway to do that. He would likely go into federal court and ask for an injunction against the state legal businesses, and I think he would probably win it. Now, what he would be left with is not what the conservatives would like, and that's why I have some optimism that once they look at that option, they're going to decide, no, that's really not where we want to go. Because what would happen is this. No state is under an obligation to mimic the federal law. So, therefore, the fact that they would perhaps, and we think, get a federal injunction against the commercial cultivation and sale of marijuana under state law, they would be left with 8 states, including 21 or 2% of the population, in which marijuana is perfectly legal to possess and to smoke, but the only place to get it is on the black market.
Just before Sessions released his memo, 5 governors from 5 different marijuana states sent a letter to him asking that he simply respect the Cole memo, you know, the thing that protects state-compliant medical programs. How can he ignore them and say that he's upholding the will of the people?
Oh, there's no doubt. One positive thing of this fight, and it's a fight we're going to be involved in, I think, for a few months. I don't think it's going to be resolved in the short run. The positive thing is we have very strong support from the governors of Washington, Oregon, Colorado, and I think Alaska was the 4th one. I forget. I think there were 4 governors involved. But especially Washington and Colorado and Oregon, they were just saying, look, we're going to do whatever it takes. We're going to fight you tooth and nail. And it would be ironic indeed if a Republican attorney general under a Republican administration is seen using the federal government's power to shut down an industry that's created hundreds of thousands of new jobs in these states, despite the fact that those programs were overwhelmingly popular in those states. But that's what we're faced with right now.
You know, this brings up a question that I've wanted to ask you for years, actually. When we talk about this journey that you've been on for what is it, 47 years or something? How long was it?
Yeah, we started in 70, so yes, I think we're coming on to 47. It was late in 1970. So,
tell me, what kind of metaphor would you use for this project that you've been working on for so very long? Is it a long road? Is it a tall mountain? How does it feel?
Well, no, it's not been a straight line. I mean, if anybody thinks social change occurs in a totally linear fashion, they are mistaken. And I know from my own experience, during the 70s, we made great progress, and we had decriminalized marijuana in 12 states, and we thought within just a short time we would have marijuana at least decriminalized nationwide. Well, in fact, what happened was the mood of the country turned far more conservative. You had Ronald Reagan and Nancy Reagan and Just Say No and the concern of the parents groups. And instead of focusing on the damage done to individuals by being arrested, the focus was on, but what about the children? And so we lost ground. We went 18 years from 1978, when Nebraska was the last of 11 states to decriminalize marijuana. We went 18 years before we won another statewide victory. And that was 96 in California. And when the issue surfaced at that point, it had been redefined as the medical use of marijuana.
Speaking of marijuana, and medical marijuana in particular, hats off to West Virginia, who did a whole lot of badminton this week with the bill, bouncing it back and forth between the two houses. But in the end, the legislature did send a medical marijuana program to the governor's desk. There's going to be medical marijuana in West Virginia. Go team.
Well, and when you realize it is West Virginia, after all, we have to all feel good that it happened. Now, the problem is, just before the end, some jerk included an amendment that precludes the use of whole smoked marijuana. And if you notice, like the last 10 or 12 states that have legalized medical marijuana, none of them allow the patients to smoke it, even though everybody knows that that's how most patients prefer to use it, and it's quick acting when you smoke it. If you take it as a ingestible, it's an hour and a half before it kicks in, and it's almost impossible to titrate the dosage. So I think it's a stupid ploy by these state legislators. They want to be seen as helping these seriously ill patients, but they don't want them to get high because after all,
you can't let sick people feel good. Hey, thanks for mentioning this phenomenon, because there's something about it. You see it in every statehouse crafted medical program, as opposed to a program that was passed by ballot measure. At Cannabiz News, we reported that the medical program in Minnesota, for example, is having a hard time. They're struggling trying to make their program work due to lack of participation. There's just not enough patients. And I'm wondering if that's because these programs take out the smokables and the edibles and then nobody's interested. You don't have enough people to make the economy of scale work.
I'll tell you another. I think Minnesota may have been the first state to allow medical marijuana, but not to allow the patients the option of growing their own. Well, once they did that, New Jersey came right along after that, and of course they didn't allow grow your own, and indeed none of the states that have passed since, I think I'm correct, have allowed the patients to grow their own marijuana. So, and again, partly it's because they want to control the industry and they hand it off to the pharmaceutical companies to get rich, but partly it is because they don't want those patients to smoke that marijuana.
Yeah, we've noticed that it's something that they've been fighting off at the Florida state legislature and in Arkansas too. Why won't these legislators respect the will of the voters?
Yeah, exactly right. Even though the initiative clearly allows whole smoked marijuana, the Florida legislature is trying to amend it to say they won't be allowed to smoke. Now, by the way, that will be challenged immediately, and I think it won't hold up because there is no ability of the legislature in Florida, even if they had a supermajority, they cannot substantially change the voter initiative.
Okay, let me ask you a final question, because we're getting near the end of this episode. So way back 46 years ago, when you were reaching for this goal of changing the way America treats marijuana, achieving that goal 100% would have been something like repealing the federal prohibition. Is that what you said was your goal, the ultimate goal?
Yes, that's correct. That would be half the goal. Would be repealing federal prohibition and enacting state-level regulation and control. We want a place where consumers can buy their marijuana that's safe and secure. We don't want to have to go to the black market. That was never something marijuana smokers enjoyed. And it involves a certain amount of risk and being ripped off, and you don't know the quality of what you're buying. We want marijuana that's safe, convenient, and affordable. And by safe, I mean it should be tested in a laboratory so we know there are no moles or pesticides. And I want it honestly labeled as to the strength of the THC and the CBD. And I think as we learn more about it, I think we should also have the major terpenoids included. But again, that's an emerging field that we have to figure out a little bit more about how important it is. We know that. But we do know we shouldn't be smoking marijuana that has moles or pesticides, and we know it ought to be honestly labeled. And you can't require that from a black market.
If there was a countdown clock, say, a countdown to legalization for NORML to reach your goals, how close are we as of Monday, April 10th, 2017?
I'd shoot for 10 years, 420, 10 years from now. Now, there will be states, just as there was at the end of alcohol prohibition, that will choose to retain, to be a dry state for marijuana for a few more years. And there will be states where they'll legalize it, but certain counties will want to stay dry for marijuana for a few years. That's exactly what happened with alcohol prohibition when it ended. We don't want the federal government telling states they have to legalize marijuana. We simply want the federal government to get out of the way and allow the states to adopt whatever marijuana policy they're happy with. Inevitably, they will all end up with legalization.
Now, for all you listeners who think that this goal is a noble one and worth working for, let me encourage you to learn more about NORML and your local NORML chapter. You can find out more by going to NORML's website. That's NORML.org. This has been Mikel Weisser, staff reporter for Cannabiz News, and we've been talking with Keith Stroup from Washington, D.C. Join us next week for more reports of the latest from Keith in Washington. Before we go, any last words for the public, Keith?
Stay high.
Well, that's about all the time we have this week. Let me encourage everyone to join us next week where you'll catch the latest in cannabis news from D.C. and around the country. This week's episode of the Keith Stroup Show was brought to you by ultratrust.net. Protect your assets from seizure, creditors, and legal action with UltraTrust's Irrevocable Trust Fund. Visit ultratrust.net to learn more, and while you're there, download their free report, Managing the Risk of Loss, and learn about ways to legally protect your assets. That's ultratrust.net. ultratrust.net. Once again, this has been the Keith Stroup Show. I'm Mikel Weisser, and you're listening to Cannabiz News.